Thank you for tuning in to New York Kids. Let's take a deep dive. New York Kids is a school improvement hub situated within the University at Albany, committed to informing, inspiring, and improving New York State schools. In this podcast, we engage in these principles through conversations with educators, researchers, and advocates for high-quality education. We invite you to join us as we explore the practices, policies, and research shaping education today, so you can make meaningful, positive change in your school community, wherever you are.
Okay, great. Hello, and welcome to New York Kids Deep Dive Podcast. I'm Kristen Wilcox, Director of New York Kids, along with Erin Leo, New York Kids Assistant Director of Research. And accompanying me today is Associate Professor Lucy Sorensen from the Public Administration and Policy Department at the University at Albany. We can't wait to get this conversation started, but first a little bit about our guest, Dr. Sorensen. Her research uses quasi-experimental methods with administrative data to examine questions related to K-12 education policy, human development, and social inequality. She is particularly interested in the ways in which public school systems interact with other systems, such as criminal justice, environmental, and health systems, to shape long-term individual trajectories. Dr. Sorensen received a PhD in public policy and MA in economics from Duke University. She currently serves as an associate editor of the journal Educational Evaluation and Policy Analysis and is a member of the board of directors of the Association of Education, Finance, and Policy. Welcome. We are delighted to talk with you today.
Thank you so much for having me on the podcast. I'm really looking forward to it.
Okay, we'll pass the ball to Erin to get us started.
Hi, Lucy. Thanks for joining us. We thought we could just start by asking you just what drew you to your research agenda, and then anything that you've maybe focused on in your most recent research.
Yeah, so my research agenda actually comes from, I think, the experiences I had growing up as a kid, which is that my family moved around a lot. We moved from, at one point we were moving pretty much every year from rural area to urban area and back and forth. And so I think I just experienced a lot of different types of schools, and I was really affected by this idea that what school we go to and what environment we're in has this ability to shape long-term who we spend time with, whether we go to college, what type of job we have as an adult. And so then from an academic perspective, I became really interested in the ways in which public school systems and policies shape these broader patterns of social and economic inequality. And as Kristen noted, I have kind of a quantitative background, so really using data and research to understand how we can best improve fairness in these systems. And in terms of my recent research, so my agenda has been pretty broad, and recently I've been working in a few different areas. So first, I've done some work that explores teacher labor markets and issues such as teacher turnover and shortages. Second, I've been doing some research exploring school discipline and policing in schools, particularly in relation to racial equity in schools. And then third, I've done some work in the area of K-12 education finance, particularly in New York State, and thinking about things like state aid formulas as well as school building conditions across the state. So I'm really happy to talk about any of these today.
Wow, that's a big agenda. And I'm just so excited to touch base with you again because we were just talking about how we got connected with each other through the minority health disparities research that was seed funded from the University at Albany. So that was great, and we had some great analyses with Ashley Fox, and really looking at how coming out of the COVID pandemic, some of these disparities were quite extreme, and also things that have lingered into our communities for the years since the pandemic was at its height. So I'm just wondering about, and any of those kind of lines of inquiry that you've been examining in your research over the last few years, areas that you think are like a really high priority when you think about P-12 education, particularly in New York State, from your research? What do you think those issues are?
Question. I think one high priority issue, and this is related to the project that we worked on together, that you just alluded to, is kind of the mental health and well-being of students. And so coming out of the pandemic, there's been a lot of talk and concern about academic recovery, which is obviously going to be essential in the years moving forward. But I think that something we talked a lot about in that project, and that is, I think, is really important, is the social and emotional recovery that needs to happen for students as well as for teachers, and that I would argue is really a prerequisite for us getting to those academic, quote, achievement levels that we were at prior to the pandemic, or improving past that point. I think another kind of high priority issue has to do with labor shortages and just labor market conditions. And so this gets talked about a lot for teachers, the fact that there can be shortages in certain areas, but it affects really the whole school. So professionals working with individuals with disabilities, psychologists, social workers. And so I think a second high priority issue, in addition to this mental health and well-being of students, would also just be making sure that there are systems in place that fully support a stable and positive working environment for teachers, and that we're able to really recruit and retain all of these professionals that are needed to support schools.
Yeah, I was looking at one of the articles that is fairly recent. I think it was a 2020 article, that the hidden costs of teacher turnover, and I think that was conducted in North Carolina, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So a different state, but I'm just thinking, it probably resonates a little bit with what we're seeing in New York. And I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about like this piece about, the teacher kind of well-being, and in keeping teachers engaged, and the impacts of having a stable, engaged teacher workforce in our schools, and the impacts on the teachers themselves, each other, and then also kids. A little bit about that study. I mean, I thought it was a really interesting one.
Yeah, so that study came out of, I worked with my professor and colleague, Professor Helen Ladd at Duke, and we did a few different papers looking at teacher-related issues and policies in North Carolina, and the one most recent you mentioned, the hidden costs of teacher turnover. And I think, in those studies, we were really looking at measurable impacts, things like what's the impact of teacher turnover on the composition of teachers at the school? What's the impact on student achievement? Some of these things that we can quantitatively pick up. But I think the research really speaks to something broader, which is that if you have a workplace where there's just constant churning, and you have, a larger and larger proportion of the teachers are novice and may not be staying that long, it creates kind of a ball rolling down the hill of consequences, where it means that the new teachers coming in don't have mentors to help them. It means that year to year, there's not as much stability, such that teachers can kind of learn from each other and know what practices are regular. And it also creates disruption for students. And so finding ways to keep teachers in schools longer, to make it places that they want to stay longer, I think is really critical. And North Carolina and New York are different contexts in some ways. So, for instance, New York pays its teachers a lot better. New York has a teachers union versus there's not allowed to be a teachers union in North Carolina. And so some of the contexts are different there. And in many ways, teachers are better protected and supported in New York. At the same time that they're still kind of at the mercy of a lot of these external factors that affect teachers' day-to-day jobs. They're still affected by budget cuts. They're still affected by federal actions, and just the new and growing challenges of working in a school environment.
Yeah, I was wondering if you noticed anything in that study in particular about kind of disparities in different communities serving different populations, where there's more concerning things happening here versus over here.
Yes. So in general, the turnover is going to be highest in schools serving students that have a high concentration of poverty. So these tend to be more challenging schools to work in for a variety of reasons. There's also more turnover in urban schools where there's actually, in that case, it's mostly because teachers have more options for where they work. In a rural district, there may be fewer schools for teachers to choose among. In urban districts, many more. And so the issues look a little bit different across different communities. And in the rural communities, the issue might be, if this teacher leaves, do we have anyone who could replace them, right? Versus in the urban communities, it might be more of an issue of just kind of that turning and the disruptive effect that it can have on schools and students. So we did see some interesting differences. And although I haven't looked at it specifically in New York, I imagine it could look quite similar here.
Did you see any promising practices around keeping that churn down, suppressed, and keeping folks in schools?
Yeah, we talked about a number of different policy options. One of the things that comes up time and time again is really just leadership seems to be one of the most important things in a school to retain teachers, is having a really good principal who supports their teachers, helps them improve. And so I think, putting a lot of attention into making sure that we're training and recruiting the best school leaders is important. Another thing that's, a potentially promising practice is having a variety of incentives to try to recruit and retain teachers in higher need schools. So, and this has looked different in different places. In DC, the impact program obviously has an incentive structure such that you can get paid much, much more if you're a high performing teacher and you are in one of those high need schools. But there are also just different ways of creating incentives, whether it's student loan repayment or housing incentives or things like that, to help draw teachers to the schools that need them the most, and then also hopefully incentivize them to stay there such that they don't go there and leave 1 or 2 years later.
Yeah, I was really interested in picking up where you also mentioned this theme in your research around where you're arriving anyway at kind of concerns about the social emotional well-being of young people. So I wondered if you could talk about that at all. What have you found around that in your research? Any specific articles that you've written on this?
Yeah, I haven't written any specific articles on this. I'm working on a couple of projects with a PhD student here at UAlbany, having to do with mental health of youth and the services surrounding that being provided in schools. And her name is Mian Jung. And, some of what we've been finding, first of all, she's found that mental health conditions, at least self-reported mental health conditions, are definitely getting worse over time. A lot of other research has supported that. There's more suicidal ideation and other, depressive symptoms, a variety of indicators that are trending in directions that are not good. And they're trending that way for almost all student subgroups. However, at the same time, there's more being done to try to address these issues. And this is one thing that came up a lot. I worked on as part of a large team at the Rockefeller Institute, the Foundation AIDS study, and we did these listening sessions across New York State about hearing from different people about what they need. And one of the most common things that came up over and over again from teachers, from principals, superintendents, is that the cost to educate children is no longer just the cost of putting a teacher in a classroom and the cost of textbooks, that the mental health and social emotional needs of students coming out of the pandemic is just so much greater, and that comes at this greater cost. You need to have social workers, psychologists, a variety of different types of people in the school.
Mm. Wow, that's so interesting. I mean, we're right now in New York Kids, thinking about the design of our next study. We usually do this on an every other year basis, and we haven't studied elementary level schools in almost a decade. So we've had a lot focused on secondary level, just using graduation outcome measures and other things to identify what we call the positive outlier schools. But this time we're like refocusing in on elementary, and we're just looking at like, okay, what variables would we be interested in to identify quote unquote positive outliers? And it's tricky, right? Because the academic outcomes are so important. And to your point, the public school system has kind of been designed here to be focused, kind of hyper focus on academic preparation, but we have this kind of very tangible and apparent and felt need to address the social emotional side of this equation of how do you help young people, feel okay about themselves and be able to interact, in a productive kind of way, in a healthy kind of way with each other. Yeah, and I was just wondering if you have any comments on that, whether it's related to Foundation Aid or any of your research.
Yeah. And I mean, one thing as you're thinking about identifying promising practices, I mean, another indicator that maybe you could focus on is really attendance, because I do think that attendance moves more closely with, how is the family doing? How is the student doing? Is the student engaged? Does the student have transportation to and from school? How is their health? Things like that I think test scores can pick up, but don't always pick up. And so schools where they're doing a good job of supporting students, making sure they're attending school regularly, avoiding chronic absenteeism, could be a really interesting thing to do. In New York, we're studying right now funding for community schools, which again provides a lot of wraparound resources, and at least in a couple of studies been found to be quite effective at reducing absenteeism, reducing suspensions, things like that. And so I think that will also be looking at how that can be implemented well, because it can be implemented a million different ways, would be interesting to look at in terms of a promising practice.
And my head just kind of went to another one of your articles because I was thinking about the climate in schools. Is a school a place where, you know, community members, parents, kids feel that sense of welcome, safety? It's something that when I talk to a lot of principals and superintendents, they're just really striving to have that kind of, place that this is a welcoming place. This is a place that people want to be. And maybe related, maybe not, but I thought it was really interesting, your study that I think it was called the thin blue line. It was kind of about school resource officers. And I was just wondering if you could share a little bit about like what went into like thinking about designing that study, and if you could give our listeners kind of a sense of like what was that study about? I thought some of the findings were fascinating.
Thank you. Yeah. So I've done a couple of studies now, a few studies now, looking at school police officers in particular. This is never a line of work I thought I would get into, but it's something that's been really interesting. It's a very controversial issue, which is basically, do police officers belong in schools, and do they help make schools safer, or are there other potential unintended consequences? And that's kind of where we were coming at with that study, is we wanted to look at we had done one study in North Carolina, but we wanted to look nationally, what's going on with school police officers, what effect do they have on the level of violence at schools, and what effect do they have on other types of outcomes, such as disciplinary outcomes. And until recently, there really was almost no data on school police officers because they're not technically school district personnel. They're not going to be in those personnel files. And so there are these people in schools that, and now in more than half of the schools in the public schools in the country, and in some states like Texas or Florida, basically every school in the state, where even though we think of them as protecting from certain specific types of events like mass school shootings, in reality, those happen quite rarely. Obviously, less rarely than we would like them to, much less rarely than we would like them to in the US, but quite rarely. But the SROs are there in the school every day. They're interacting with students. What impact does that have? And so what we found in that study is that the effects on school violence were fairly modest, but that there were these pretty large increases in arrests of students, suspension of students, and other disciplinary actions taken against students, and particularly Black students and students with disabilities, right? So we're seeing a more punitive environment within schools when there's a police officer there, where maybe minor incidents that would have been dealt with by a principal previously are now being kind of escalated to the next level. And so, yeah, it's been really interesting thinking about that project and thinking about what does it mean for a school to be safe or feel safe, because sometimes those can be different things, and how does having a police officer there affect that?
Yeah, I was just wondering, what's your interpretation of that when you think about, okay, what is, how might a principal then, think about what they do with the safety issues in their school based upon what you found?
So do you mean like how they work with the SRO, or whether they should have an SRO?
Exactly, like all of that. Like what's the pathway there? What is the thinking behind whether you have these resource officers in your building or not, and what the alternatives are if you decide not to?
Yeah, so and I spoke with a principal recently, and he said, I love SROs because it means if a fight breaks out in the cafeteria, I'm not the one who has to be physically breaking up that fight. That's not my job, et cetera, et cetera. So there are a bunch of different perspectives here, and parents and teachers, and their feelings of safety are all important. And so it really comes down to I think this answer is going to vary community by community. Chicago has gotten rid of all of their SROs in high schools. And they seem to be having pretty positive results with that. Whereas there might be other places where people feel better with the police officers being in the school. And, some of the things, policy options we've been talking about are things like improving training of SROs, having better MOUs, so agreements where the police officer would agree to not, get involved in minor disciplinary matters, things like that. But yeah, I think that if we can build these better preventive approaches, things like restorative practices, PBIS, there are a million different types of interventions that are trying to take a more proactive, preventive approach to student behavior. And I think the more that we can build those up and make them better, the more we avoid the need for having police in schools, the need for harsh discipline, and some of these things that can harm students.
Yeah, I have just one last question, and then I'm going to pass it to Erin. But I'm wondering about with your work on the foundation aid. I think that's really interesting work that was coming out of the rig, and I know there were a lot of stakeholders involved with that. I was just wondering what your takeaways are, if you had a bullet points of a report out. Like, how did that go? Where did you land?
Yeah, I'll admit that I wasn't at the high level discussions table in terms of what the final recommendations were, but I was at a lot of the parts where we were reviewing what are other states doing, what's working well in New York, what's not working well in New York. What distributional impact does the hold harmless policy have, which is where districts, when they lose students, they're kind of able to maintain roughly the same level of funding. So it was really interesting. I think a lot of issues came up that were outside the scope of that report. So for instance, having to do with the fact that we have a bunch of tiny districts in New York that are 60 students and things like that. And just the financial implications of that can be quite challenging. And so, outside of the scope of how should the foundation formula be designed, how much should go into it, who should get what, there are also these broader questions of, would there be benefits to really pushing harder towards more regionalization of districts. What a lot of this push-pull of upstate, downstate. So things like, should we account for number of homeless students, number of English language learner students, a number of these indicators that, would skew more funding towards New York City because they have a lot more of these different types of high-need populations. So lots of interesting discussions. I wasn't really a part of the group that came up with recommendations, but it was really interesting to get to learn about that.
Yeah, it sounds like I need to follow up with some folks over at the RIG and find out what else they have to share with us, because I know these are really impactful discussions and decisions. Okay, I'll pass it to Aaron. I know he's got another question to ask you.
Yeah, so, thinking about all the insights that you've gained through this research and other experiences, we kind of had a final question about improvements, kind of addressing the challenges that you've identified in New York State. So where do you see opportunities for leaders, educators, parents, and other community leaders to support improvements in what's done in P-12 schools?
Yeah, I think just maybe building off of a few different things we've talked about this conversation. Again, in a state like New York that has resources at its disposal, it has a strong public school system. I really think that thinking about this concept of resiliency of schools to various shocks, and we've seen them a lot over the past few years in terms of the pandemic was an enormous shock. Everything that's happening at the federal government level right now is having all of these spillover effects onto districts and schools. And so finding ways and in addition to the shocks that happen with lots of teacher departures and issues with the teacher pipeline. And so I think finding ways to really provide some resiliency and stability within schools and districts would be really important moving forward. So how do you build a school environment that is resilient to losing teachers or to losing funding? How do you prepare for not something like the pandemic necessarily, but other types of, negative external events that affect families and students, and putting systems into place that can help support them through those types of shocks, I think could be really important. I know that's very broad, but
yeah, it's really, really interesting. And I also was thinking about moving forward. And while we've really loved having you at UAlbany, we wish you the best in your new position. You're going to be a principal researcher at the Learning Policy Institute. Would you like to tell us about, what's on your horizon there?
Yeah, thank you so much. It's definitely bittersweet to be leaving Albany, but I'm really excited to be joining Learning Policy Institute and getting to work on some of these types of policy issues at the state and federal level over the next few years. And yeah, I'll be working on a lot of the same things that we've been talking about today. So teacher workforce and teacher quality issues, school finance, I think, which will be really important, state school finance systems, especially in the era of, perhaps changes in federal funding, as well as school safety, health, in case there are additional policy efforts moving forward, which there will be at hardening schools and things like that. So I'm not sure exactly what projects I'll be working on, but those are the types of things I'll be working on. I'm excited.
That all sounds great, and we'll have to keep in touch.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, we really appreciate your time. This has been a great conversation. And again, Lucy Sorensen, good luck with your next steps in your career. And thank you for sharing about your research today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you both very much. And thank you for everything that New York Kids does, which is really inspiring.
Yeah, we love to do the work.
Thanks, Lucy.
Bye, everyone.
Hey everyone, Paul Gay here. I'm a research assistant at New York Kids and the editor of this podcast. I just want to take a moment to thank our Director of Research and Development, Dr. Kristen Wilcox. Her leadership, vision, and support have made this podcast and so much of what we do at New York Kids possible. Thank you to the rest of our team, Aaron Leo, Jesse Tobin, Maria Khan, and Manaswi Katoju, whose commitment to finding guests, conducting interviews, and collaborating on ideas really keep this work alive. Also, thank you to David and Josiah Marticello, who wrote and recorded our theme music. Most of all, thank you for taking an interest in New York Kids. Did you enjoy this episode? Please like, follow, or subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Over half of our listener base is not subscribed, so if that's you, please click that button. Leave us a comment, a review, drop us a like. This really helps us in the long run. If you have any questions or comments about this episode or anything else, please send us an email at nykids@albany.edu. For more information about the research that we conduct and the work that we do, check out nykids.org. Have a wonderful day, and remember that this is all for the kids.